Welcome to DevSecOps, the good, the bad, the ugly. This videocast series is about all things DevOps, as well as we place an emphasis on putting security into that practice. If that's something that you're interested in, be sure to hit the subscribe button so you can follow the great leaders that I'm speaking to in this space. My name is Zach Knorr, and I'm your host. And today I have with me Andrei. Andrei leads the application security practice at Symphony. Andrei, can you introduce yourself and share why everybody should be tuning into what we're going to talk about today?
Hey, Zach, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in your show. Yeah, so as you were saying, yeah, I'm a security engineer at Symphony. My main focus on application security. Basically, I'm responsible for the development and the security of development that is performed at Symphony, making sure that everything that gets released and gets maintained afterwards is done in a secure fashion by respecting the best practices.
That's awesome. No, I really appreciate you coming on here. Somebody actually had reached out to me, a friend of mine, and recommended that I chat with Andrei. So I definitely appreciate your time here. What can we learn from you? What are the lessons learned that you can share with us?
Yeah, I would like to tell you a quick story about that. So when I got to Symphony, as I was saying, the secure development process was well established and well executed, but it was lacking some formalization. So basically, I started to perform some training with all development teams across the world to explain them why security matters and why they should be thinking about security when developing, and not only also before coding starts, after the coding, after the implementation part finishes. So basically trying to embed security in all stages of the development process. In other words, establishing a well-defined SSDLC, Secure Software Development Lifecycle.
Yep. Yep. So what was the lessons learned along the way that you could share with us?
One of the lessons learned is that InfoSec is always one of the bottlenecks for development, because every time something that needs to get released right away, anyway, it has to, even if it's urgent or not, it has to pass for our approval. Otherwise, if we think that it's not secure enough or it might present too much risk, of course, it needs to be fixed before it gets released. So as you can see, we might get seen as a bottleneck, as a gatekeeper for production, but we're doing this for the right reasons, for the good reasons, and we're only doing this to protect the organization and the engineering teams. The problem about that is that sometimes the review process, depending on the project, can take a lot of time. Basically, you want to make sure that all the design of the product is well established, that the code is secure. Afterwards, you want to test it. You want to test a little bit the application in case it's possible. Of course, it's a mobile app or web app. You want to make sure that it's not vulnerable to any of the most common web application. In case of a web application, you want to think of the list of the top 10, basically the top 10 most encountered web application risks in applications and vulnerabilities. So as you might think, as you might imagine, it takes time. And most of the things that we do, actually, we wanted to empower development teams, engineers, testers, basically all engineers, to do that, because what we were doing was not something that was only scoped for the InfoSec team. We want to empower the engineering teams to think about security and also implement it properly when doing their day-to-day job.
Right. So what were some ways that you were able to, I know the buzzwords there, but shift that feedback left to the developers and maybe change mindset? What happened there?
Exactly. So actually, that's a very good question. Well, as I was saying, we were looking at the code. So basically, you look at the code to make sure that input is validated, the output is also taken care of. You're not logging sensitive data. A lot of logging is performed logging is performed when it should be done. So basically, you do that with in order to automate the process, you run some static application security testing tools. There are a lot of tools out there. So basically, you run them through the code to make sure that all the things that I mentioned before are done and your code is secure. You also want to make sure that the dependencies of your project are not vulnerable, and you're not using any vulnerable libraries or vulnerable versions, that your dependencies are up to date. This is for development part. After development finishes, of course, it passes through testing. In the testing part, you want to make sure that if you're having a running instance of your application, if it's a web or a mobile application, you want to make sure that you submit it to some extensive testing that usually gets done during pen testing campaigns. And basically, this I'm talking about dynamic analysis security testing, DAS tools. Of course, it does not replace an actual pen test session, but it does help mitigate. It helps a lot to mitigate the vulnerabilities that you are, or greatly reduces the number of vulnerabilities that your application might contain. So it's a very good way of making sure that afterwards the number of findings that would come up in a pen test report would be very, very small.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, another question that I always like to, try to, think about is what about outside of the software development life cycle? What is it? Maybe it could be training or whatever, right? What are some other things that you could focus on that maybe is not necessarily within the software development life cycle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, you make a very good point, and maybe I should have started with that. So in order for all this to make sense for engineering teams, they need to understand, okay, because some of them ask, okay, I know my code is good. Why should I submit it to test? And I know that I'm using the latest libraries. I'm not sure that there's anything vulnerable inside them. Well, you don't know. You have to submit it to test, and you need to have them understand the concepts of security, of information security, and you need to start that with training, just like you said. So we started having regular, knowledge sharing session, like brown badge sessions, and presentations about security, and more specifically information security in development world, engineering world. And you need to start, in order to make sure that everybody understands, because some of them have more advanced knowledge, some of them have more, maybe they're on the product management side, but they still need to be aware of these concepts. So you need to start at a very high level, like a 10,000 feet attitude, to make sure that they understand. So you need to start with the very basics of information security. You need to start with the 3 pillars of security, which are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality basically means that information, because of course your company, your product runs on data. That data is the most important thing for you. So you want to make sure that this data does not get disclosed to unauthorized parties.
Sure, right.
Integrity basically stands for the fact that your data should not be altered, or it should always be complete, and you should maintain that no unauthorized parties would be able to modify it in order to, if you have a transaction, you want to make sure that that it was not altered with. And availability, you want to make sure that information is, of course, as the name stands, available, but to the authorized parties, and it's not available to the unauthorized parties. So basically, from these 3 very simple concepts, afterwards you start going lower and lower. You start to go to some secure software concepts, for example, complete mediation or separation of privileges, and you need to make them understand. If you have, let's say, I don't know, a banking application, you want to make sure that when you perform a transaction, there are at least 2 persons, 2 entities, at least 2. Normally there are much more, but just to make things very easy to understand. Well, let's say that when you receive your paycheck, there's a person that creates the paycheck, that sets it up, and afterwards there's the person that validates the paycheck. So you cannot have the same person doing both of the things, because otherwise, well, you can do a lot of fraud. So yeah, when things start to make sense, they start to understand why security matters and why these kind of concepts need to be respected when developing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And so educating, once people are educated, they're aware of that. So that's awesome, Andrei. Hey, appreciate you being willing to come on here, take some time. I know it's on a Saturday too, so take the time to be willing to come on here. I do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure being in your show.